"Don't embarrass him in front of the neighbors," my mother whispered. I stood still, blood trickling from my mouth, my eye already swelling shut. The man who had just struck me strolled back into the house as if nothing happened. What he didn't know was that his punch had just ended everything. I didn't call the police. I called my lawyer. My name is Natalie, 33 years old, and the life I inhabit is one I built with the precision of an architect designing a fortress. My apartment is a small, one-bedroom sanctuary on the 17th floor of a glass and steel building in a city that hums with an anonymity I find deeply comforting. It's clean, minimalist, and every object has its place. A leather-bound collection of classic literature sits on a floating shelf, a silent testament to the full scholarship that was my ticket out. A single, thriving orchid rests on the windowsill, its purple blooms a small, defiant splash of life against the gray urban canvas. This space, this life, is mine. It is ordered, it is quiet, and it is 4 hours away from the place I used to call home. 4 hours by car, a lifetime by emotional distance. Professionally, I am a legal consultant at Lundwell Strategies, a private firm that specializes in navigating the labyrinthine world of corporate compliance and civil litigation. My colleagues know me as meticulous, calm under pressure, and possessing an almost preternatural ability to find the fatal flaw in an opponent's argument. In the hushed, mahogany-paneled conference rooms, my voice is even, my logic unassailable. I advise men and women twice my age, people who command fortunes and industries, and they listen. They pay a handsome sum for my counsel because I provide clarity in chaos. I build walls of reason and precedent to protect them. The irony is not lost on me. I am paid to protect powerful people. Yet for years, I failed to protect myself from the two people who were supposed to be my safest harbor. My mother, Donna, remarried 10 years ago. It was a whirlwind affair that began at a local VFW fish fry and culminated in a small courthouse ceremony I was expected to applaud. The man she married is Roger, to the outside world. He is a salt-of-the-earth type, a small business owner with a firm handshake and a ready laugh that never quite reaches his eyes. To me, he is a black hole of resentment and control, a man whose presence sucks the very air from a room. He is a patriarch from a bygone era, convinced of his own inherent superiority by virtue of his gender and the volume of his voice, and from the moment he entered our lives, he has viewed me not as a stepdaughter, but as a rival for my mother's attention and a symbol of a world-educated, independent, female that he fundamentally despises. The foundation of our family dynamic was laid early and set in concrete. I was the high achiever, the one who buried herself in books and extracurriculars, the good girl, who earned a full ride to a prestigious university. This should have been a source of pride. For my mother, perhaps it was, in a quiet, apologetic way. For Roger, it was an affront. My successes were never just my successes. They were implicit criticisms of his own life, of his high school diploma, and his struggling contracting business. He developed a particular brand of condescension designed to whittle me down to size. My degree was a piece of paper that doesn't teach you common sense. My job was pushing paper for rich city folk. My apartment was a shoebox that cost more than a real house. Each comment was a small, sharp jab, delivered with a smug grin over the dinner table, and my mother's response was always the same. A nervous flutter of her hands, a quick glance in my direction, a murmured, "Now, Roger," before she would inevitably change the subject. She never defended me. Defense would have required confrontation, and my mother's entire existence is a study in the avoidance of it. Their home, the house I grew up in, feels like foreign territory now. It has been remade in Roger's image. The walls are covered in taxidermy and framed photos of him holding up a depressingly large fish. The scent of my childhood cinnamon and baking bread has been replaced by the stale odor of cheap beer in his work boots by the door. My old room is now his office, a cluttered space where he supposedly manages his business, but mostly watches sports on a television too large for the room. My presence there is an intrusion, and he makes sure I feel it. He will interrupt my conversations with my mother to ask a question he already knows the answer to, or stand in the doorway with his arms crossed, just listening, his silence more intimidating than any outburst. My financial stability is perhaps the greatest insult of all. I worked hard for it, through college and law school, climbing the ladder at my firm. I don't live lavishly, but I am secure. I have savings, a retirement plan, and the freedom to buy what I need without checking my bank balance with bated breath. This independence is a wall he cannot breach, so he tries to undermine it. He'll make loud pronouncements about how kids these days don't know the value of $1. His eyes fixed on me. He'll tell stories about men he knows who lost everything to some high and mighty career woman, a cautionary tale meant for an audience of one. The lowering of my value is a constant, subtle erosion, a process my mother not only allows but actively participates in. She has become his accomplice, the gentle warden to his gruff jailer. He's just from a different generation. Natalie, she'll say in a hushed phone call, as if that excuses the deliberate cruelty. You know how men are. Their pride is fragile. Her apologies for him are a constant refrain. A soothing balm she applies to wounds he inflicts, hoping it will be enough to keep the peace, but the peace is always his peace, purchased at the cost of my dignity. She frames my reactions, my hurt, as the problem. My sensitivity is the issue, not his boorishness. My desire for respect is recast as arrogance. If I push back, if my voice takes on a hard edge, she will panic, her eyes pleading with me. Don't start, she'll whisper. Just let it go, for me. For a long time, I did. I let it go. I learned to compartmentalize. There was work Natalie confident, articulate, respected, and there was home Natalie silent, accommodating, shrinking herself to fit into the cramped space they allowed for her. I would make the 4-hour drive a few times a year for holidays and birthdays, bracing myself as if for impact. I'd sit through dinners where Roger held court, pontificating on subjects he knew nothing about, belittling my opinions with a dismissive wave of his hand. I would watch my mother scurry around him, refilling his glass, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes. A woman I barely recognized. I would feel the anger coiling in my stomach, a cold, hard knot, but I would swallow it. Just as I swallowed his insults, I would do it for her, or so I told myself. Perhaps I was just doing it because it was easier than the alternative, easier than the fight, the explosion, the inevitable severing that felt too final, too terrifying. So I played my part in the family charade, the dutiful daughter who drove home to be reminded, again and again, that she was not enough. But even the strongest materials wear down with time, and my tolerance had been eroding for a decade, ground down to a fragile, transparent sliver. I just didn't know it yet. I didn't know that it would only take one more blow, one final act of humiliation, to shatter it completely. The architecture of my suffering wasn't built in a day. It was a slow, meticulous construction, brick by brick, insult by insult, laid over a decade. Each incident, on its own, might seem small, a petty grievance that a good daughter should overlook, but stacked together, they formed the unbreachable walls of a prison. My memory, trained to recall case law and contractual clauses with unerring accuracy, serves as the perfect warden for these grievances. It holds them all in sharp, perfect focus, each one an exhibit in the long, silent trial I was conducting in my own mind. Exhibit A. The roof, 3 years ago. My mother called me in a state of quiet panic. A bad winter storm had torn a section of shingles from the roof, and a persistent leak had stained the ceiling in the living room, the one directly above Roger's leather recliner. He was, she said, fit to be tied. His contracting business was going through a slow patch, and they didn't have the cash on hand for the several $1,000s it would take to fix it properly. I didn't hesitate. I was proud to be in a position to help. I've got it, Mom, I said, the words feeling good and solid in my mouth. It felt like a tangible way to show my love, to fulfill my role as the successful daughter. I transferred $8,000 to her account the next day, with the note, "For the roof, love you." 2 months later, I drove down for her birthday. As I pulled into the driveway, the first thing I saw was not a new roof. The same curled shingles and faded asphalt were still there, a testament to neglect, but a brand new Ford F-150, a monstrosity of chrome and black paint, gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was the kind of truck with a price tag that felt like a slap in the face. It sat parked exactly where my modest sedan should have been. I felt a cold, sinking dread in my stomach. I found them in the kitchen. I kept my voice even, a skill honed in hostile negotiations. "The truck is new." Roger, leaning against the counter with a beer in his hand, grinned. It was the grin of a man who had just pulled a fast one and was daring you to call him on it. "She's a beaut, ain't she? A man needs a reliable vehicle for his business." "And the roof?" I asked, my eyes on my mother, who was suddenly very busy arranging napkins. "We'll get to it," he said, waving his beer bottle dismissively. "This was a business investment, an asset. I sent that money for the roof, Roger, for the house." His grin vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. "And I used it to invest in the business that pays the mortgage on this house. It's all the same pot. Little girl, don't you get your fancy law degree in a twist over things you don't understand?" I looked at my mother. Her face was a mask of strained neutrality. Donna. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just wrung her hands and whispered, "Natalie, please, don't start. Don't embarrass him." There it was, the family motto. My violation was not in being stolen from. It was in noticing. My sin was not the loss of $8,000. It was the potential embarrassment of the man who took it. Later that night, after he had gone to bed, she came to my room. "He didn't mean it like that," she began, the familiar litany of excuses. "He's just under a lot of pressure, and we did use some of it to patch the worst part of the leak. We'll save up for the rest." She was treating an arterial bleed with a Band-Aid and telling me to be grateful. I said nothing. The silence in that room was heavy with everything I wanted to scream. I had given them a shield, and he had hammered it into a sword to use against me, and my mother had held it for him. Exhibit B. The dinner table. This was his favorite arena, the place where he could hold court, and I was a captive audience. It happened so many times it blurs into a single, recurring nightmare. But one Thanksgiving stands out. The table was laden with food my mother had spent 2 days preparing. I had brought an expensive bottle of wine, which Roger had grunted at before opening a can of Coors Light for himself. He started in on one of his usual tirades, this one about the coddled generation that expected handouts. His eyes kept flicking to me. "They go to their fancy schools, read their fancy books, and then they come out thinking they know everything," he boomed, gesturing with a turkey leg. "They don't know what a real day's work is, never had dirt under their fingernails." I made the mistake of engaging. "I think every generation faces its own economic challenges," I said calmly. "The world is just different now." He slammed the turkey leg down on his plate. "Different. You call being soft and entitled different? I call it a damn shame." He then turned to me, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "It's no wonder you're not married. What man wants a woman who's going to argue with him all the time? Tell him he's wrong. You gotta learn to be a little softer. Natalie, it's not attractive." The insult was so blatant, so personal. It stole the air from my lungs. I could feel the heat rising in my face. I opened my mouth to retort, to dismantle his pathetic, chauvinistic argument with the cold, hard facts of my own existence. But before I could utter a word, my mother's hand was on my arm, her fingers pinching lightly. "Let it go, honey," she murmured, her eyes wide with a familiar, desperate plea. "He's just tired. He's been working so hard." He was tired, the ultimate absolution. His exhaustion was a blanket excuse for his cruelty. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card he played again and again, and she was the one who dealt it to him. My hurt, my humiliation, was an inconvenience that disturbed his need for rest. so I fell silent. I ate the dry turkey and the lumpy mashed potatoes, the taste of ashes in my mouth. I watched him pontificate, secure in his throne, shielded by his wife's enablement. These were not isolated events. They were the cornerstones of a carefully maintained system of control. Every attempt I made to establish a boundary was treated as an act of aggression. Every push for respect was framed as a tantrum. The language of my oppression was subtle, couched in the vernacular of family and tradition. "That's just how men are," my mother would sigh, after Roger made a particularly cutting remark about my career. "You can't take it so personally." This phrase, more than any other, was the key to my cage. It normalized his behavior, painting it as a force of nature, as unchangeable as the tides. It implied that the fault was mine for not knowing how to navigate it, for not being pliant enough to bend to his will. Don't make a scene. Don't wash our dirty laundry in public. Don't embarrass the family." These were the commandments, the rules of a game I could never win. The goal was not to be happy, or respected, or safe. The goal was to maintain the illusion of a normal, happy family for an audience of neighbors and relatives who probably didn't care anyway. My role was to absorb the dysfunction, to be the silent shock absorber that kept the family vehicle from rattling apart. And so, I did. A change occurred in me, so gradually I didn't notice it until it was complete. The hot, coiling anger in my gut cooled. The sharp sting of hurt faded. In their place grew a hard, protective callus over my heart. I learned to disassociate. I could sit at that dinner table and listen to his rants and feel nothing. It was like watching a particularly boring and predictable movie for the 100th time. I knew all the lines. I knew where the cheap jump scares were. I became an observer of my own life, a consultant analyzing a flawed system from a safe distance. The emotional connection had been severed. Only the biological one remained. This numbness became my shield. It was a cold and lonely defense, but it was all I had. I convinced myself it was a form of strength, this ability to endure, to swallow the poison and show no ill effects. I believed it would be enough to get me through the obligatory holidays, the command performance birthdays. I thought my tolerance had no limit. I was wrong. My endurance wasn't a callus. It was a sheet of tempered glass, growing more and more rigid with every blow, until one final fateful impact would prove it was never meant to bend. It was always meant to shatter. The drive down was a 4-hour meditation on a single, fragile hope that for one evening, for my mother's 62nd birthday, a truce could be observed. I had bought her a cashmere sweater in a soft blue that matched her eyes and a bottle of the expensive French perfume she loved but would never buy for herself. These were my peace offerings, my tribute paid at the gates of a hostile kingdom. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw my mother through the kitchen window, her silhouette moving with a familiar, anxious energy. For a fleeting moment, the hope flickered brighter. Maybe tonight would be different. The illusion shattered the moment I walked through the door. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and Roger's simmering resentment. He was in his usual throne, the worn leather recliner, a can of Budweiser sweating in his hand, the television blaring a cacophony of sports commentary. He offered a grunt that was his version of a greeting, his eyes never leaving the screen. My mother rushed to embrace me, her hug too tight, too brief. "Oh, Natalie, I'm so glad you could make it," she whispered, as if my presence were a surprise and not a prearranged filial duty. On the counter sat a grocery store sheet cake, its garish pink frosting and crookedly piped, "Happy Birthday, Donna," a sad monument to a celebration that already felt like a wake. We sat down to dinner in a state of carefully managed tension. My mother chattered nervously about the neighbors, the weather, a new sale at the department store, anything to fill the silence that Roger seemed to cultivate like a prized, venomous plant. He ate with a sullen intensity, punctuating his meal with loud gulps of beer. He was on his 3rd can before the chicken was even carved. I knew the signs. This was the prelude, the quiet gathering of storm clouds before the inevitable deluge. He started, as he often did, with a backhanded compliment aimed at a third party. "Heard the Hendersons' youngest, Sarah, just got engaged," he announced to no one in particular. "Nice boy. Plumber. Got his own business. Smart girl. That's Sarah. Knows what's important." He swiped a piece of chicken through the gravy on his plate, his eyes finally landing on me. Some people just get it. Family, a home, a husband, things that matter. I placed my fork down, my hand steady. The old Natalie would have stared at her plate, willing herself to disappear. But the callus over my soul had grown thick, and I was tired of disappearing. "That's wonderful for Sarah," I said, my voice as neutral and cool as a legal brief. "I hope she'll be very happy." My refusal to take the bait only enraged him. "Happy," he scoffed, the word a wad of phlegm in his throat. "You wouldn't know happy if it bit you on the ass. Living up there in your shoebox, working for those corporate crooks, 33 years old? What have you got to show for it, huh? Nothing but yourself. Ungrateful is what it is, after everything your mother and I have done for you." "What you've done for me?" The question was quiet, but it sliced through the room. I put myself through school. I pay my own bills. I built my own life. I am here today to celebrate my mother's birthday. That is a choice I made out of love for her. His face, already florid from the beer, darkened to a deep, dangerous crimson. The veneer of a family man cracked, revealing the ugly, brittle ego beneath. "You got a smart mouth on you. Always did." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the linoleum. He stood over me, a large, menacing shadow reeking of stale beer and fury. "You think you're better than me?" It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. Before I could process his movement, his hand arced through the air. The sound was a sharp, flat crack, like a dead branch snapping. My head whipped to the side, my cheek exploding with a white-hot, stinging pain. The room tilted, the floral wallpaper swimming before my eyes. In the ringing silence that followed, I could hear his ragged breathing and the frantic, shallow breaths of my mother. And then, her voice, a desperate, gutless whisper from across the table. "Don't embarrass him," she begged. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Roger, what have you done?" Just, "Don't embarrass him." The words were a second, more brutal assault. The slap had been an attack on my body. Her words were an annihilation of my soul. They confirmed everything I had always known, but never wanted to believe in the eternal war between her husband's ego and her daughter's safety. I would always lose. I stood up, my chair making no sound. I didn't look at either of them. I felt a strange, chilling calm descend over me, the kind of clarity that comes in the aftermath of a fatal diagnosis. The long, agonizing battle was over. I walked out of the dining room, through the living room, and pushed open the screen door to the front porch, the rusty spring groaning in protest. I just needed air. I needed to be out of that suffocating house. The humid night air, thick with the scent of cut grass and impending rain, did little to cool the fire on my cheek. The porch light cast a sickly yellow glow, illuminating the tidy suburban street. Across the way, the Miller family's television flickered through their picture window. A dog barked somewhere down the block. It was a portrait of peaceful domesticity. I heard the screen door slam open behind me. "You don't walk away from me," Roger snarled. His footsteps were heavy on the wooden planks. I didn't turn. I kept my eyes fixed on the perfectly manicured lawn across the street. I was done with him, done with the arguments, the insults, the entire pathetic performance. His hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. His face was contorted, a mask of pure rage. "I'm talking to you." Then came the second blow. It wasn't a slap this time. It was a fist, a clumsy, beer-fueled punch that caught me high on the cheekbone, just below my left eye. The force of it sent me stumbling backward, my heel catching on the edge of the welcome mat. I fell, my hip and shoulder hitting the hard wooden porch with a jarring thud. For a moment, I just lay there, the rough painted wood scraping my cheek, my head filled with a dull, throbbing roar. From my vantage point on the floor, I saw the curtain in the miller's window twitch. Someone was watching. The screen door opened again. This time it was my mother. She didn't rush to my side. She didn't scream at him. She grabbed Roger's arm, her small frame straining. "Get inside," she hissed, her voice a low, panicked whisper. "Roger, for God's sake, get inside. They'll see you." She wasn't saving me. She was hiding him. She was cleaning up the scene, managing the public relations of our family's ugly little war. He allowed himself to be dragged back into the house, and the screen door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the yellow light. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. My face throbbed with a deep, cavernous ache. I touched my lip and my fingers came away wet and sticky, blood. I could feel a warm trickle making its way down my chin, a single, hot tear of crimson that fell onto the collar of my white blouse. I didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been cauterized in the fire of my mother's whisper. The numbness I had cultivated for years had finally cracked open. But what emerged was not grief or rage. It was ice. It was the cold, unassailable logic of a litigator who had just been handed an airtight case. My movements were slow, deliberate, devoid of panic. I reached into my purse, which had fallen beside me. My fingers brushed past my wallet, past my keys, and closed around the cool, smooth rectangle of my cell phone. I unlocked it, swiped to the camera, and switched it to the front-facing view. The screen showed a stranger's face, a distorted, monstrous version of my own. My left eye was already beginning to swell shut, the skin around it a mottled, angry purple. A cut on my lip oozed blood, which had smeared across my chin and neck. My hair was a mess, but my eyes, my one good eye, was perfectly clear. It was glacial. I angled the phone slightly to catch the porch light, ensuring the damage was perfectly illuminated. My hand did not shake. My breathing was even. Then, I pressed the button. The soft click of the shutter echoed in the silent night. It was the only sound that mattered. It was not a call for help. It was the sound of evidence being collected. It was the sound of the end and the beginning. The 4-hour drive home was a silent, hermetically sealed capsule of transformation. The world outside my car, the blur of headlights, the endless ribbon of asphalt, the dark. Sleeping towns ceased to exist. My entire universe was the throbbing, insistent pain in my face, the hum of the engine, and the single, crystalline image of the photograph on my phone. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a terrifying, preternatural calm. I was no longer a daughter, no longer a victim. I was a consultant who had just been presented with a new case. Client Natalie. Objective justice. Opposing counsel. Everyone. Halfway through the drive, in the stark, fluorescent glare of a deserted gas station where I stopped for fuel and a bottle of water, I performed the first official act of my new life. I pulled up my mother's contact, her name. Mom seemed like a relic from another civilization. I could see a string of missed calls and a frantic text message. "Natalie, please call me. We need to talk." I ignored them. I typed out a new message, my fingers moving with surgical precision. The words were cold, sterile, and utterly final. "This is the last message you will receive from me directly. Do not call or text me again. From this point forward, any and all communication must be directed through my legal counsel, whose information will be provided to you in due course." I read it over once, twice. It was perfect. It was the kind of language Roger would understand, the language of consequences. I sent it. Then I blocked her number. I did the same for Roger's. The act felt less like closing a door and more like cauterizing a gangrenous wound. It was a clean, painful severance. With that, 10 years of enabling, of whispered excuses and shared blame, were erased. When I finally arrived at my apartment building, the city was just beginning to stir, its gray pre-dawn light soft and forgiving. My doorman, a kind older man named George, gave me a concerned look as I passed. "Rough night, Ms. Natalie?" he asked, his eyes lingering on my swollen face. "You could say that, George," I replied, managing a tight, painful smile. Just a disagreement with a concrete wall. The wall won. Inside my sanctuary, I dropped my keys and purse on the console table and leaned against the door. The cool wood a comfort against my back. The silence of my apartment was absolute. Here, there was no shouting, no heavy, menacing footsteps, no whispered betrayals. There was only order, my order. I walked into the bathroom and finally, under the harsh, unforgiving light, took a full account of the damage. The photograph hadn't done it justice. My left eye was nearly swollen shut, surrounded by a spectacular blooming bruise that was already turning a deep shade of purple and black. The cut on my lip was ugly, a split that would surely need a stitch or two. My jaw ached with a deep, resonant pain. I wasn't just hurt, I was marked. He had put his brand on me. I worked with detached efficiency, the way I'd seen paramedics in movies. I cleaned the cut, applied a butterfly bandage, and held an ice pack from the freezer to my eye until the cold was its own kind of pain. There was no self-pity. This was not a wound to be mourned. It was evidence to be preserved. Every throb was a reminder. Every pang of pain was a line item in the long list of his debts. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across my living room floor, I sat on my sofa with a mug of black coffee and my laptop. The physical pain had receded to a dull, manageable ache. In its place, my mind, my greatest asset, was coming alive in a way it never had before. It was a machine kicking into high gear. Gears and sprockets that had been dormant for years now spinning with a frictionless, silent speed. And the memories started to come, not the emotional ones of past hurts, but practical, useful memories, data points. I had, for my entire adult life, been the family's pro bono paperwork monkey, because I was the smart one, the one with the head for numbers, every piece of confusing mail, every government form, every inscrutable bank statement from their chaotic lives was eventually pushed in my direction. "Can you just look this over, honey?" my mother would ask, handing me a crumpled shoebox full of receipts and overdue notices during one of my visits. Roger gets so frustrated with all this red tape. I had always hated it, had always resented being tasked with cleaning up their financial messes, but I had done it, and in doing so, I had seen everything. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I created a new, encrypted folder on my hard drive. I named it Project Chimera, a monster made of disparate parts. Inside, I created my first document, Initial Case Assessment R. Donovan. I started with the taxes. For the last 5 years, I had helped my mother prepare their joint returns using off-the-shelf software. Roger's business. Rogers Home Solutions LLC was a single-member LLC, a pass-through entity. Its profits and losses were reported on a Schedule C attached to their personal 1040 form. I remembered the shoeboxes of receipts he would provide: gas receipts, Home Depot slips, bills from restaurants where he was entertaining clients. I remembered how disorganized they were and how I had painstakingly categorized them. But I also remembered the discrepancies. The receipts for new fishing gear listed under equipment, the suspiciously high vehicle expenses the year he bought that F-150 with my roof money. I had questioned it once, and my mother had waved it away. "Oh, he knows what he's doing. It's for the business." I hadn't pushed. Now, I wished I had taken copies, but the memory was there, a clear and actionable starting point for an IRS audit. Then, a bigger memory surfaced: the pandemic, government support. My mind flashed to a specific visit in the spring of 2021. My mother had handed me a thick packet of documents from the Small Business Administration. "Roger got one of those loans," she'd said. "Can you make sure this is all filed correctly?" I remembered the letterhead clearly. It was an economic injury disaster loan, an EIDL, and there was another one for the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP loan. These programs were lifelines for struggling businesses, but they came with ironclad rules. The funds had to be used for specific, documented purposes: payroll, rent, utilities, mortgage interest. I remembered the amounts, tens of thousands of dollars, and I remembered that just a few months later, Roger had installed a new 60-inch television in the living room and had taken my mother on a cruise to the Bahamas, their first real vacation in years. At the time, I'd naively thought his business must be doing well. Now, the pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. He hadn't used that money for payroll. He was his only employee. He hadn't used it for rent. His office was a spare bedroom in the house they owned. He had used taxpayer money, funds meant to keep a small business afloat during a national crisis, as his personal slush fund. And I, Natalie, the legal consultant, had held the proof in my hands, the loan application, which used the home address, the award letters, the bank statements. All of it had passed through my unwilling stewardship. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place, a memory from long ago. Shortly after they were married, my mother, looking confused, sitting at the kitchen table, Roger standing over her, impatient. "Just sign it, Donna. It's for the business line of credit. It's just a formality." He had tapped the page where she needed to sign. She had signed it without reading. I was there. I was a witness. A line of credit. Co-signed by my mother. What had he used it for? How much debt was attached to her name? To the house she had owned outright before he came along. He had exploited her trust, her ignorance, and her fear of confrontation to leverage her assets for his own gain. It was the legal definition of financial abuse. I stopped typing. The sun was fully up now, streaming through my windows. My coffee was cold. I looked at the document on my screen. It was no longer just a list of grievances. It was a roadmap. Fraudulent tax deductions, misappropriation of federal disaster relief funds, potential forgery and financial abuse of a vulnerable spouse. The girl who had been punched on a porch less than 12 hours ago was gone. In her place was a woman who saw the world in causes of action, in burdens of proof, in statutes of limitations. Roger had spent a decade chipping away at my self-worth with words. He had used his fists to prove a point, but he had forgotten what I did for a living. I didn't fight with fists. I fought with paper. I built cases so airtight, so meticulously documented, that by the time my opponent walked into the courtroom, they had already lost. He thought he had ended the conversation with a punch. He had no idea he had just delivered my opening argument. On Monday morning, my face was a kaleidoscope of pain. The swelling around my eye had subsided into a grotesque, multi-hued bruise, deep purple bleeding into a sickly yellow-green at the edges. The butterfly bandage on my lip felt tight and foreign. It was the perfect visual aid for the meeting I was about to have. I didn't bother with concealer. I wanted him to see it. Arthur Vance was not the kind of lawyer who advertised on billboards. His firm, Vance Investigative Solutions, was located in a discreet brownstone in a quieter part of the city. His name had been given to me by a senior partner at my own firm, whispered with a reverence usually reserved for federal judges. "If you need to find something someone doesn't want found," he had said, "Arthur is the man you see. He's more of a surgeon than a lawyer." Vance was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair, a tweed jacket that had seen better decades, and eyes that missed nothing. They flickered over my face for a fraction of a second as I sat down in the worn leather chair opposite his cluttered oak desk. It was the only acknowledgement he made, but it was enough. He had seen the exhibit, and it had been entered into evidence. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Your colleague, Mr. Abernathy, said it was a matter of some urgency." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I slid a thin file folder across his desk. It contained the initial assessment I had compiled over the weekend, a timeline of events, and a high-resolution printout of the photograph I had taken on the porch. "That is the precipitating event," I said, my voice steady. "But it is not the cause of action I am here to pursue. The assault is merely a symptom of a much deeper disease. I am not interested in a restraining order. I am interested in total financial annihilation." Vance opened the folder. He read for several minutes in complete silence, his expression unreadable. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. He scanned my notes on the SBA loans, my recollection of the tax filings, my suspicion about the co-signed line of credit. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sharp and analytical. This is a serious and complex set of allegations. Ms. Sterling, financial abuse, potential wire fraud, tax evasion. To build a civil case of this magnitude requires more than memory. It requires a paper trail, a clear, irrefutable chain of evidence. I know, I said. That's why I'm here. I can give you the map. I need you to excavate the treasure. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning in protest. Excavations of this nature are expensive, and they are invasive. We would need to subpoena bank records, loan applications, business filings, credit card statements. We would be putting your mother and stepfather's entire financial life under a microscope. It can get very ugly. Mr. Vance? I said, leaning forward. Ugly as a man punching his stepdaughter in the face in front of God and the neighbors because she dared to speak. What you're describing is just accounting. I have a significant amount in savings. Use whatever you need. I want you to find everything. A slow, thin smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth, but of professional appreciation. He had his answer. All right, Ms. Sterling, let's go digging. The next few weeks were a masterclass in controlled demolition. Vance's team, a small group of forensic accountants and former federal investigators, moved with terrifying efficiency. The first subpoenas were fired off like warning shots across Roger's bow. We started with the SBA. The response from the government agency was a treasure trove. The PPP and EIDL applications were exactly as I remembered, only worse. On the application for the Paycheck Protection Program loan, Roger had listed 3 employees for Rogers Home Solutions, LLC. The program was designed to keep people on the payroll, but he had no employees. He was the only employee. He had invented 2 phantom workers likely to triple the amount of the loan he was eligible for, and had been pocketing the entirety of the payroll himself. It was blatant, unambiguous fraud. The EIDL application was just as damning. Vance's team cross-referenced the dates of the loan disbursement with Roger's bank records, which we had also subpoenaed. A week after a $50,000 deposit from the U.S., Treasury hit his business account. There was a $10,000 withdrawal. 2 days after that, a charge from a cruise line. 3 weeks later, a $35,000 cashier's check made out to a local Ford dealership. The paper trail was a neon sign pointing directly to misappropriation of funds. He hadn't just used the money as a slush fund. He had documented his crimes with the cheerful abandon of a tourist sending postcards from his vacation. But it was the next discovery that made my blood run cold. Vance called me into his office. On his desk, spread out like exhibits in a murder trial, were several documents. One was a loan application for the F-150. Another was a withdrawal slip from a savings account at a regional bank. The account was a joint account in the names of Donna and Roger Donovan. My mother had never mentioned this account. We pulled this as part of a comprehensive asset search, Vance said, pointing to the withdrawal slip. It was used as part of the down payment on the truck. Note the signature. I looked at the scrawled signature on the line, Donna M. Donovan. It was a close approximation of my mother's handwriting, but something was off. The loops were too tight, the slant too aggressive. It looked like her signature, but without any of her gentleness. My mother has arthritis in her hands, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She hasn't been able to sign her name that sharply in years. Our thoughts exactly, Vance said grimly. He slid another piece of paper across the desk. It was a report from a forensic handwriting analyst. The conclusion was stated in cold, clinical language. It is with a high degree of professional certainty that the signature on the withdrawal authorization was not executed by the same individual who provided the known exemplars of Donna M. Donovan. Furthermore, evidence of simulation and tracing suggests a deliberate attempt to forge the signature. He had practiced. The thought was sickening. I imagined him sitting at the kitchen table, a piece of my mother's mail in front of him, carefully tracing her name over and over until he got it right. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a cold, calculated act of theft against the woman who shared his bed. He had siphoned profits from his business cash payments from clients that never got reported into this secret account, then forged her name to steal it back for his own use. My $8,000 for the roof was just the tip of the iceberg. This was a pattern of deliberate, methodical financial predation. The final blow came a week later. The formality my mother had signed years ago was not a simple business line of credit. It was a home equity line of credit, a HELOC for $100,000, secured against the full value of the house, a house my mother had brought into the marriage. Her name the only one on the original deed. He had convinced her to add his name to it a year after they were married, a gesture of unity. Then he had used that unity to put a lien on her only significant asset. Vance's team discovered that he had drawn nearly $80,000 from it over the years. The statements, which went to a P.O. box he'd opened without her knowledge, showed the funds had been used for a series of failed investments, a new set of golf clubs, and to pay off personal credit card debt. He had effectively mortgaged my mother's future to finance his lifestyle and his incompetence, all while making her believe his business was barely scraping by. I sat in Vance's office, the file now thick with evidence. It was a biography of a con man, written in bank statements and forged signatures. The picture was complete. This wasn't just about a punch. It was about a decade of systematic abuse, emotional, verbal, and financial. He hadn't just been a bully. He was a parasite, slowly draining the life and security from my mother. "We have enough," Vance said, his voice quiet. "We can file a civil suit alleging financial abuse, conversion, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. We can also make referrals to the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding the SBA loans and to the IRS for tax evasion. We can ruin him. Ms. Sterling." I looked down at the file, at the cold, hard proof of his treachery. There was no elation, no thrill of victory. There was only a grim, resolute certainty, the feeling of a surgeon who has located the tumor and knows it must be cut out, no matter how much it will hurt the patient. "File it," I said. "File it all." The decision to act was a single moment of clarity. The execution was 1,000 moments of cold, deliberate resolve. In the weeks that followed my meeting with Arthur Vance, my life bifurcated. Outwardly, I was the same meticulous legal consultant. I advised clients, drafted memos, and attended meetings, my bruised face fading to a pale, yellowish shadow that was easily covered with makeup. But inwardly, I was a general commanding a silent, patient siege. My only communication with the front lines was through Arthur. Every other channel was dead. The first volley was not a bomb. It was a letter. But it was a letter engineered to have the concussive force of an explosion. I reviewed the final draft in Vance's office. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. Printed on his firm's heavy cream-colored letterhead, it was addressed to Mr. Roger Donovan, with a carbon copy noted for Donna M. Donovan. It was not a request. It was a demand. It formally stated that his wife, Donna Donovan, was now represented by their firm in a matter concerning significant financial irregularities and potential marital asset dissipation. It invoked state laws regarding fiduciary duty between spouses and demanded a complete and transparent accounting of all personal and business assets, including bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and a full, unredacted history of all loans and lines of credit. It contained a stark warning of litigation hold. This meant he was legally obligated to preserve every single financial document, every email, every receipt. Any attempt to hide, alter, or destroy records would be considered spoliation of evidence, with severe legal penalties. The final paragraph was the payload. It informed him that if a comprehensive response was not received from his legal counsel within 10 business days, we would immediately file for an emergency court order to freeze all known personal and business accounts pending a full forensic audit. "It's an invitation to cooperate," Vance said, a dry smile playing on his lips. "The kind of invitation that feels like a threat." "He's never cooperated a day in his life," I replied. "He'll see it as a declaration of war." "Good," Vance grunted. Wars are easier to win when the enemy is angry instead of smart. We didn't mail it. Vance dispatched a professional process server, a grim-looking man who guaranteed personal delivery. I imagined the moment of impact, the knock on the door, my mother's confusion, and Roger's face as he was handed a crisp, professional envelope containing the blueprint for his ruin. I didn't have to wait long for the aftershock. 2 days later, my phone, which had been blissfully silent for weeks, began to buzz. The screen lit up with her picture, a snapshot from a few years ago. Her smile genuine, her eyes untroubled. It was a face from a life that no longer existed. I watched the screen, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. The call went to voicemail. A minute later, a text message. Natalie, what is this letter from a lawyer? Call me. I read the preview on my lock screen and did not open it. An hour later, another call, voicemail, another text. This is a terrible mistake. You need to call them and tell them to stop. Then a third, an hour after that. Roger is going crazy. You have to fix this. I silenced my phone and placed it face down on my desk. The ghost of an old instinct whispered in my ear. The conditioned response of a lifetime of peacemaking. Just call her, calm her down, explain it. But the new Natalie, the one forged on that porch, silenced that voice with brutal efficiency. To answer would be to re-enter the game, to accept the premise that her panic was my responsibility. It wasn't. This was the consequence of her choices, of a decade of looking the other way. My silence was not an act of cruelty. It was the establishment of a boundary, drawn in stone and enforced by a wall of lawyers. While Roger was still reeling from the first shot, the second one landed. This one didn't come from a downtown law firm. It came from the United States Department of the Treasury, acting on the detailed whistleblower report Vance's team had filed. The Internal Revenue Service had officially opened an inquiry. A thick, intimidating envelope arrived at their house, bearing the kind of return address that makes even the most honest citizen's blood run cold. It was a summons for Roger to appear for an in-person interview with a field agent from the Criminal Investigation Division, and it required him to bring every tax and business record from the past 7 years. That was the call that broke through my mother's carefully constructed denial. The buzzing of my phone on the kitchen counter became incessant. A string of panicked texts lit up the screen, each more frantic than the last. The IRS sent a letter. Natalie, what did you do? Roger says you are trying to send him to jail. This has to stop. You are destroying this family. For the love of God, answer your phone. Natalie, I am begging you. The voicemails were even worse. I listened to the first one out of a clinical, detached curiosity. Her voice was a ragged tapestry of tears and terror. Natalie, honey, it's me. Please, please call me. I don't understand any of this. Roger, I've never seen him like this. He got a letter from the government. He says you reported him. Why would you do this to us? To me, we can fix this. Whatever it is, just call me, please. I deleted it without a flicker of emotion. The word us no longer included me. I was not a part of their us. I was a separate sovereign nation, and they had committed an act of war. Now they were facing the consequences. My own phone calls were few and Spartan. I spoke only to Arthur Vance. Our conversations were brief, tactical updates. The process server confirmed delivery of the demand letter 2 days ago, he said one afternoon. As expected, your mother's phone calls began shortly thereafter. I know, I said, looking at the log of 27 missed calls on my phone. And I just received confirmation from my contact at the Treasury Department. The IRS summons was delivered via certified mail at 11:42 this morning. Excellent. His 10-day window to respond to our letter is closing. Have you heard from any legal counsel on his behalf? No, I said. Only from my mother. Her messages are becoming increasingly hysterical. Let them, Vance said, his voice flat. Panic is a poor strategist. He's probably scrambling, trying to figure out what we know. He'll either hire a lawyer at the last minute or try to brazen it out. Either way, we're ready. That evening, I sat in my quiet apartment, the city lights twinkling outside my window. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. My mother's name flashing for the 38th time that day. I didn't flinch. I let it ring. For 10 years. They had demanded I listen. I had listened to the insults at the dinner table. I had listened to the excuses for his behavior. I had listened to the justifications for his cruelty. My role was to absorb, to endure, to listen. I was done listening. Now, it was their turn to face the silence. It was their turn to wonder, to fear, and to wait for the next move. And they would never see it coming from a direction they expected. I was no longer the daughter they could guilt into submission. I was the client, and my only counsel was a man who dismantled lives for a living, and we were just getting started. Roger, true to form, did not respond with a lawyer. He responded with arrogant silence. He missed the 10-day deadline without so much as a phone call. He believed, with the unshakable conviction of a lifelong bully, that our demand letter was a bluff. He thought he could ignore the problem until it went away. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his opponent. I was not a yapping dog. I was a wolf, and my teeth were already at his throat. On the 11th day, Arthur Vance filed an ex parte motion in civil court for a temporary restraining order to freeze Roger's assets. The motion was accompanied by a thick binder of preliminary evidence, the bank statements showing the SBA loan deposits, followed by personal expenditures, the handwriting analyst's report on the forged signature, a sworn affidavit from me detailing a decade of financial control and abuse. A judge reviewed it in chambers and signed the order within an hour. By noon, the court order had been electronically served on every financial institution where we had identified an account in his name or the name of his business. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. When Roger went to pay for gas with his business debit card, it was declined. When he tried to pull cash from an ATM, the screen flashed insufficient funds. When he logged into his online banking portal, the balances on his checking, savings, and business accounts that should have held tens of thousands of dollars all read zero on. The money was still there. Of course, but it was locked in a legal purgatory from which he had no power to retrieve it. He was, for the first time in his life, broke. The pressure mounted on other fronts. The Small Business Administration, having received our detailed report, moved with bureaucratic but implacable force. Roger received a certified letter informing him that his EIDL and PPP loans were under official review for fraudulent misrepresentation and misuse of funds. He was declared immediately ineligible for any future government contracts or assistance programs. The letter was a death sentence for his business, which relied heavily on a reputation, however unearned, as a legitimate local contractor. The word would get around. He was no longer just a bully. He was a cheat. But the true masterstroke, the move designed to bring the entire rotten structure crashing down, was aimed at the one thing he and my mother shared: the house, with his accounts frozen. Roger couldn't make the monthly payment on the home equity line of credit he'd been concealing for years. The automatic payment bounced. The bank, as banks are wont to do, sent a notice. It was a crisp, impersonal letter addressed to both Roger Donovan and Donna Donovan, informing them that their account was in default and that failure to remit payment could result in foreclosure proceedings. That was the letter that finally broke through my mother's wall of denial and forced her to confront the reality that this was not just about Roger's pride or my hurt feelings. This was about her home. The four walls that represented her entire life's savings and security were now in jeopardy because of the man she had protected. Her panicked calls, which had subsided to a resentful smolder, started again with a new, raw terror. She left a voicemail where she wasn't crying, but breathing in ragged, hitching gasps, the sound of a person on the verge of complete collapse. I listened to it once, then deleted it. It was time. The siege had weakened the city walls. It was time to offer terms of surrender. I instructed Arthur Vance to send a second letter. This one was different. It was sent via courier, addressed only to Ms. Donna M. Donovan, and marked strictly personal and confidential. It was not a demand, it was an offer, a life raft thrown into the churning waters of her collapsing world. The letter was written in plain, simple language, stripped of most of the legal jargon. It began by gently but firmly laying out her legal position. It explained the concept of joint and several liability, making it clear that because her name was on the deed, she was just as responsible for the HELOC debt as Roger was. It explained that her signature on their joint tax returns meant that the IRS could hold her equally liable for any back taxes, fines, and penalties resulting from his fraudulent deductions. It explained that her status as a co-owner of his business assets, including the accounts he used to launder the SBA money, could entangle her in the federal fraud investigation. Page by page, it dismantled the fiction that she was merely a bystander. It proved to her, in black and white, that her silence and complicity had made her his legal partner in crime. The picture it painted was bleak: a woman on the verge of losing her home, facing crushing debt, and potentially staring down federal charges, all because of the man she had chosen to protect. Then, on the final page, came the offer. It was titled Proposal for Resolution. It stated that I, Natalie, was prepared to amend my civil complaint. Instead of naming her as a party with an interest in the disputed assets, I was willing to name her as a co-plaintiff, Natalie Sterling and Donna Donovan versus Roger Donovan. The offer came with a single, non-negotiable condition. She had to tell the truth. Attached to the letter was a prepared affidavit. It was a detailed, chronological account of everything we had discovered, written as a first-person declaration. It just needed her signature. It contained statements like, on or about April 12, 2021. My husband, Roger Donovan, presented me with a document he described as a formality for the business and instructed me to sign it. I did not read the document and was not aware I was signing an application for a home equity line of credit against our property, and I have reviewed the signature on the withdrawal slip dated August 2, 2022. I did not sign that document, nor did I authorize the withdrawal of funds from that joint account. It was a confession, not of her guilt, but of his. It was a weapon, forged from her own painful experience, that she could either hand to me to use against him or allow to be used against herself. The letter concluded by giving her a choice. Option A. Sign the affidavit. Join me as a co-plaintiff and allow my legal team to represent her interests. We would fight to have the HELOC declared fraudulent and unenforceable against her. Shield her from the IRS investigation by declaring her an innocent spouse and ensure that she retained sole ownership of the house and any other marital assets that were rightfully hers. She would be protected. She would be safe. She would be free. Option B. Do nothing. Refuse to cooperate. In which case, she would remain legally entangled with Roger. She would face the bank, the IRS, and the U.S. Attorney's Office as his partner. She would be forced to sell her home to pay for his debts. She would share in his ruin. I gave her 72 hours to decide. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt a profound and unsettling sense of power. For my entire life, she and Roger had held all the cards. They dictated the terms of my existence in their home. They set the rules of engagement. They decided what was acceptable, what could be said, what had to be endured. Now, I held the cards. I had become the architect of their reality. I had laid out the options, defined the consequences, and set the deadline. A woman who had been dismissed, insulted, and assaulted now held the fate of the two people who had wronged her in the palm of her hand. The choice was no longer mine to make. For the first time, it was hers, and I would live with either outcome. The request for a meeting came on the final day, with 6 hours left on the clock. It didn't come from a blocked number or a desperate email. It came, as I knew it would, through the only sanctioned channel. Arthur Vance's assistant called me. Ms. Sterling, I have a Donna Donovan on the line. She is quite distraught. She insists on speaking with you directly. She says she needs to see you in person. I looked out my office window at the orderly grid of the city streets below. Everything was in its place. Tell her I will meet her. I said, my voice betraying nothing. There's a diner called the Midway Point, exactly halfway between my city and her town. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., tell her to come alone. The Midway Point was a perfect slice of Americana, a place caught in time with its red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't been updated since the 90s. It smelled of coffee, bacon, and regret. I arrived early and chose a booth in the back corner. Ordering a black coffee I had no intention of drinking, I watched the door. She arrived exactly at 10, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen her. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes red-rimmed and darting around the room as if she expected to see Roger lurking in a corner. She saw me and shuffled over, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. She slid into the booth opposite me. For a long moment, she just stared, her eyes tracing the faint, yellowing remnants of the bruise on my cheekbone. The sight of it seemed to break whatever fragile composure she had left. The tears came, not loud or hysterical, but silent and exhausted, rolling down her cheeks and dripping onto the worn Formica tabletop. "Natalie," she began, her voice a choked whisper, "you have to stop this." I didn't respond. I simply took a sip of my cold coffee and waited. A waitress came by, and my mother waved her away with a shaky hand. This is a nightmare," she continued, fumbling in her purse for a tissue. "The letters, the bank, Roger hasn't slept in days. He's like a caged animal. You don't know what you've done." "On the contrary," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the small table. "I know exactly what I've done. I've presented you with a choice." "A choice." She let out a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. "You call this a choice? You're asking me to destroy my husband, to destroy my own life." "I'm asking you to save yours," I corrected her gently. "By putting the man I live with in jail, by signing a piece of paper that calls him a criminal." Her voice rose, laced with a familiar panic. "It's not that simple. Natalie, you don't understand the circumstances. The business has been so hard, and he's been under so much pressure. Men like him, their pride is everything. He made mistakes, yes, but he was trying to provide for us, for me." It was the same old song, the anthem of her entire marriage, the litany of excuses I had been forced to listen to for a decade. But this time, I wasn't listening as a daughter, I was listening as an attorney, and her argument was weak, based on emotion and a willful ignorance of the facts. "He didn't make mistakes. Mom," I said, my tone flat and factual. "He committed federal crimes. He stole from me. He forged your name. He put your home, the only thing you have in this world, at risk to pay for his toys and his failures. And then he struck me in the face when I questioned him. These aren't circumstances. These are actions, choices that he made." She shook her head, the tears flowing freely again. "But what am I supposed to do if I sign that paper? He'll never forgive me. I'll have nothing. I'll be all alone." And there it was, the heart of it all, the deep, gnawing fear of being alone, a fear so profound that she would rather live with a monster than face an empty house. She would rather be a prisoner in a familiar cell than a free woman in an unknown world. My own anger, which I thought had been burned out of me, flickered for a moment, a hot, bitter flame. Anger, not at her fear, but at her refusal to see that she was already alone. She had been alone for years, in a marriage where she was not a partner, but a tool and an alibi. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not let the anger show. I simply delivered the truth, a truth that had been a decade in the making. "You chose him," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's scalpel. "Over 10 years ago, you chose him. You chose to ignore his insults. You chose to excuse his cruelty. You chose to protect his ego over my safety, over and over again. When he hit me on that porch, you chose him. When you pulled him back inside instead of helping me up, you chose him. Every text, every phone call begging me to stop, this has been you, choosing him." I let the words hang in the air between us, heavy and irrefutable. Her weeping subsided into small, hiccuping breaths. "That's the choice you made," I continued. "And you have to live with it, but you don't get to make my choices anymore. Today, right now, in this cheap diner, I am choosing my freedom. I am choosing a life where I am not a shock absorber for a violent man's rage. I am choosing a life where my worth isn't determined by my ability to remain silent. I am choosing me." I slid the affidavit, which I had brought in my briefcase, across the table. Beside it, I placed a pen. "This is your last choice, Mom. You can sign this paper and choose yourself, too, or you can refuse, and choose him one final time. But know this either way. The lawsuit against him continues. Your signature only determines whether you are a survivor standing with me or collateral damage left behind with him." She stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. Her hand hovered over it for a long, agonizing moment. I could see the war playing out in her eyes, the flicker of hope for a different life warring against a lifetime of fear and conditioned submission. I could see her weighing the terror of his anger against the terror of her own freedom. In the end, fear won. It always did. Her hand retreated. She shook her head, a small, final gesture of defeat. "I can't," she whispered, her voice broken. "Natalie, please, don't make me. I can't. He's my husband." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, not love. Just a vast, empty distance. The final thread had been cut. She had made her choice. I calmly slid the unsigned affidavit and the pen back into my briefcase and stood up. "Okay," I said. It was the only thing left to say. I left a $10 bill on the table for the coffee and walked out of the diner without looking back. Before I even reached my car, I called Arthur Vance. "She refused," I said. "I'm not surprised," his gravelly voice replied. "What are your instructions?" "Amend the complaint," I said, the words coming easily. The plan already fully formed. "We're dropping the request to have Donna Donovan named as a co-plaintiff. Remove her from the direct line of fire. I'm no longer trying to save her marital assets. We're proceeding with a suit solely in my name, Natalie Sterling versus Roger Donovan. The causes of action are conversion for the $8,000 he stole from me and assault and battery, for which we will seek punitive damages. We will still use all the evidence of his financial crimes against her as proof of a pattern of behavior to establish intent and malice. Make her a witness to her own abuse, not a participant in her own liberation." It was a strategic and subtle shift, but a profound one. My mother was no longer the objective. She was no longer a prize to be won or a victim to be saved. She was simply a fact in my case against him. By refusing to sign, by making her final choice, she had rendered herself irrelevant. The war was now a personal one, between him and me, and he had no idea what kind of enemy I had become. With my mother relegated to the status of a fact witness, the legal battle became brutally simple. It was no longer a messy family drama. It was a straightforward civil action. Sterling v. Donovan. The amended complaint was a lean, vicious document. Count I conversion, for the $8,000 stolen from me for a roof that was never repaired. Count 2, assault and battery, for the slap and the punch that served as the catalyst for this whole affair. We weren't just seeking compensation. We were seeking punitive damages, a legal measure designed not to make the victim whole, but to punish the defendant for malicious conduct. Faced with a lawsuit he could no longer ignore, Roger was finally forced to hire a lawyer. He chose a man named Bill Peterson, a local attorney whose billboard on the highway promised aggressive representation for DUIs and divorces. Peterson was out of his depth from the moment he took the case, a small-town brawler stepping into the ring with a world-class surgeon like Arthur Vance. The discovery process was a slow-motion vivisection of Roger's life, and his deposition was the main event. It took place in a sterile conference room in Vance's office. Roger sat across the table from me, his face a blotchy red, his cheap suit too tight across his shoulders. He tried to project his usual brand of bullying arrogance, but it was a flimsy shield against the relentless, methodical onslaught of Vance's questioning. Mr. Donovan, Vance began, his voice deceptively mild. Let's talk about the Paycheck Protection Program loan you received in 2021. On the application, you listed 3 employees for your business. Could you please state their names for the record? Roger shifted in his seat. Look, it was a confusing time. That paperwork was a nightmare. I'm sure it was, Vance said, his eyes never leaving Roger's face. The names, please. I don't recall off the top of my head. I had guys working for me, on and off. Vance slid a copy of the loan application across the table. Perhaps this will refresh your memory. This is your signature, is it not? Yeah, that's my signature. And right here, where it asks for the names of the employees whose payroll this loan is meant to protect, you wrote John Smith and Peter Jones. Can you provide us with the social security numbers or last known addresses for these 2 men? Roger's face went from red to a pale, sweaty gray. Peterson, his lawyer, cleared his throat and mumbled something about objecting, but Vance simply held up a hand. Your client signed this document under penalty of perjury. Mr. Peterson, I'm merely asking him to elaborate on the sworn statement he made to the United States government. The questions continued for hours, each one a precision strike. Vance had him admit that the F-150 was purchased with funds from the EIDL loan. He had him admit that he never told my mother about the home equity line of credit. When Vance presented the handwriting analyst's report on the forged signature, Roger tried to bluster. Donna signed that she just forgets things sometimes. So, your testimony is that your wife is forgetful, Vance asked, a predator sensing weakness. Would she also forget authorizing a cruise to the Bahamas? Or would she forget you opening a secret joint bank account where you deposited undeclared cash income from your business? By the end of the day, Roger was a broken man, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, cornered rage. I had watched the entire proceeding without saying a word, my expression neutral. He was no longer a monster in my mind. He was just a defendant, and a rather stupid one at that. The evidence we had compiled was so overwhelming that the judge granted our motion for summary judgment on the conversion claim, ordering Roger to immediately repay the $8,000 plus interest. The assault and battery claim would proceed to a hearing, but the outcome was a foregone conclusion. More importantly, the court accepted all our financial evidence, the SBA fraud, the HELOC, the forgery as admissible to establish a pattern of malicious conduct relevant to the awarding of punitive damages. It was a total legal victory. But my revenge was never about a courtroom. It was about his life. And that was beginning to crumble in ways he never anticipated. Court filings are public records. A stringer for the local county newspaper, bored on a slow news day, picked up the story. The headline was small, buried on page A5, but the words were devastating. Local contractor sued for fraud. Assault by stepdaughter. In a small town, a story like that is a lit match in a dry field. The rumor mill, which had been churning quietly, exploded. The details of the lawsuit, the stolen government loans, the secret debt against his own house spread like a virus. The persona he had so carefully cultivated, that of a hard-working, no-nonsense local businessman, was incinerated overnight. The fallout was swift. The owner of the local lumberyard, who had previously extended him a generous line of credit, suddenly demanded cash on delivery. 2 other small contractors he frequently subcontracted with stopped returning his calls. A lucrative kitchen remodel he was scheduled to start was abruptly postponed indefinitely. No one wanted to be associated with a man who was not only accused of hitting a woman, but of cheating the government and his own wife. His reputation, the only real asset his business ever had, was now toxic waste. The court, as part of the judgment, placed a lien on his assets until the damages were paid. The first asset they attached was the one that mattered most to him, the gleaming black Ford F-150. A deputy sheriff came to the house and slapped a bright orange seizure notice on the windshield. The truck, his monument to his own fraudulent success, now sat in the driveway as a public declaration of his failure. Cornered, humiliated, and financially ruined, Roger did the one thing I was counting on him to do. He made it personal, and he made it public. He took to Facebook. In a rambling, typo-riddled post, he unleashed a torrent of self-pity and vitriol. "Some people will never know what it's like to work with your hands and build something," he wrote. "My own stepdaughter, a slick city lawyer who I helped raise, is trying to destroy me and her mother with lies. She is a vindictive, ungrateful person who is angry she can't control everyone. She is bleeding me dry with these false lawsuits and trying to send me to jail all because she has no life of her own. Don't believe the lies from this money-hungry woman who is tearing her own family apart." He tagged me in the post. Within an hour, it had been shared a dozen times. Old high school acquaintances started texting me. "Is this true? What's going on?" I didn't respond to any of them. I took a screenshot of the post, saved it as a PDF, and emailed it to Arthur Vance with a single line, "I believe we have a new cause of action." Vance's reply was almost instantaneous. "Defamation per se. He's a fool. I'll draft the complaint." The second lawsuit, Sterling v. Donovan II, was for libel. It was a clean, simple case. He had publicly published false statements of fact that damaged my professional reputation. My character and integrity are the bedrock of my career. His post wasn't an opinion. It was a series of factual assertions that I was lying in a court of law, that my motives were purely financial, that were demonstrably false. The legal system, for all its flaws, is very good at dealing with stupidity like this. His own lawyer, Bill Peterson, likely advised him to take the post down and issue a retraction, but it was too late. The damage was done. The evidence was saved. We won. Of course, we didn't even have to go to a full hearing. Faced with another unwinnable case, Roger's lawyer advised him to settle. The settlement included a 5-figure payment for damages, and more importantly, a court-ordered public retraction and apology. He had to post, on the same Facebook page, a statement drafted by my legal team. "I, Roger Donovan, retract my previous statements concerning Natalie Sterling. The allegations made in my lawsuits were supported by evidence and found to be credible by the court. My characterization of her motives and actions was false. I apologize for the harm my statements caused to her reputation." It was the perfect checkmate. He had been beaten in court. His business was destroyed. His reputation was in tatters. And now, in the same public forum he had used to attack me, he was legally compelled to confess to the world that he was a liar and I had been telling the truth all along. It was a public humiliation, administered not with fists or fury, but with the cold, irrefutable power of the law. The war was over. The battles had been won. The treaties signed in court orders and settlement agreements. All that remained was the quiet, unfamiliar landscape of peace. I found myself in a small coffee shop several blocks from my apartment, a place with exposed brick walls, the scent of dark roast coffee, and the low hum of conversations I was not a part of. It was late afternoon on a Tuesday. The autumn sun slanted through the large picture window, casting long, golden shadows across the floor. I had no reason to be there, other than I didn't want to be in my silent apartment and I didn't want to be at my busy office. I wanted to be anonymous. I wanted to be still. My phone buzzed softly on the table. It was an automated notification from the secure online portal for Arthur Vance's firm. A new document had been uploaded to my case file. My heart gave a small, tired flutter, the ghost of an old anxiety. For months, a notification like that had meant a new front in the war, a new piece of evidence, a new motion to review. Now, it was just an epilogue. I tapped the screen. My movements unhurried. The document was a final order from the family court, a piece of fallout from the messy, inevitable divorce proceedings between my mother and Roger. I hadn't been a party to their divorce, but my lawsuit had been the bomb that blew their marriage apart, and its evidence had served as the foundation for my mother's own legal case. I scrolled through the dense legal text, my eyes scanning for the relevant clauses, and then I saw it. Clause 7b. It is hereby ordered that the respondent, Roger Donovan, is restrained from initiating any contact, direct or indirect, with the petitioner, Donna Donovan, for a period of 3 years from the date of this order. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of triumph or joy. It was a smile of profound, bone-deep satisfaction, the feeling of a broken bone that has finally set correctly after a long and painful alignment. The waitress came by and saw my expression. "Good news?" she asked, refilling my cup. "The best," I said, and I meant it. The smile wasn't for the victory. The victories, the judgments, the settlements, the public retractions had felt hollow, like meticulously documented autopsies. They confirmed the cause of death but couldn't bring anything back to life. No, this smile was for something much more fundamental. It was the smile of a person who had finally, irrevocably, stopped accepting disrespect. I thought about my mother, now living alone in the house that was, after a protracted legal fight, solely hers once again. The HELOC had been declared a fraudulent debt against her. Roger's name had been scrubbed from the deed, and the money he had stolen from her secret savings account was returned, depleting most of the funds from his frozen accounts. She was safe, she was financially secure, and she was utterly alone. She had tried to call a few times after the divorce was finalized. I didn't answer. I knew what she wanted. She wanted absolution. She wanted to cry and apologize and have me tell her it was okay, that I understood. She wanted me to soothe her guilt, but her guilt was her own to carry. An apology from her would have been meaningless. It wouldn't erase the decade of choices she had made. It wouldn't unwhisper the words, "Don't embarrass him," as I stood there with a stinging face. An apology now would be for her, not for me. And I was no longer in the business of making my mother feel better. I didn't need her apology. I had my own closure. And Roger, I pictured him, a man stripped of everything he valued. His business was gone. His reputation in their small town was a punchline. His prized truck had been sold to pay a fraction of the damages he owed me. He was living in a rented room above a bar, working odd jobs for cash. A ghost in the town where he had once been a petty king. I knew, with an absolute certainty, that he felt no remorse. He wouldn't be reflecting on his actions, on his cruelty or his crimes. He would only be consumed by a bitter, impotent rage at the injustice of being held accountable. He would forever see himself as the victim, and me as the vindictive monster who had ruined his life. To wish for his repentance would be to wish for a pig to fly. It was a waste of energy. I didn't need his remorse. I needed his fear. That was the true victory. The restraining order wasn't just about protecting my mother's physical safety. It was a symbol. It was a legal manifestation of the New World Order. It was a 3-year sentence that told them both that the rules had changed. The boundary I had drawn was no longer a chalk line they could scuff with their boots. It was a wall of steel and concrete, reinforced by the full weight of the law. I looked out the window as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The war was over because I had achieved my objective. It wasn't to ruin him. It wasn't to save her. It was to recalibrate their understanding of me. I had taught them a lesson not in morality, but in consequences. I had shown them that I was no longer a resource to be exploited or a receptacle for their dysfunction. I was a force to be respected, not loved, not even liked, but respected. They would never cross that line again, not because they understood that it was wrong, but because they now understood that I would burn their world to the ground if they did. And in that grim, unspoken understanding, I found my peace. I took a final sip of my coffee, left a generous tip on the table, and walked out of the coffee shop into the cool evening air. A free woman. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect. Feel free to share your thoughts on Natalie's journey as well. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to help support this story, hit that hype button to help it get heard by more people. Your support means the world.